So what I was going to do with you today is this. So take you through kind of 4 main areas. Start by looking at what the conflict challenges are for a leader in healthcare, at least the ones that I come across regularly, and interested to know what your views on those are as well. Then diving a little bit deeper into the sources of those conflicts. Where do they come from? What fuels them, the bits that you don't see? And then leave you with something, I hope, fairly practical about having conversations with individuals about challenging behavior, which is one of the most difficult areas that I think that leaders come across and I find people have problems with. So I thought I'd leave you hopefully with something practical, and I'll have a Q&A as well. So that's the idea. So with no further ado, the arguing penguins, conflict challenges for a leader in healthcare. And I wanted to start this off really by asking you what you found. So there's a Mentimeter for you to fill out here. Now it's very easy to do. If you go to menti.com, menti.com, on your phone or a browser window and enter that code, you should be able to respond to that question. Because I just wanted to try and source from you the kind of challenges that you see when you're trying to deal with or manage conflict. Now, if you're not a leader or a manager, that's fine as well. I'd be really interested to see what you see the leaders in your area grappling with. But yeah, see what comes out of that question. If Mentimeter is a struggle for you, you can also pop things in the chat as well. We can look at them there. It's just here. Thank you very much. Keep them coming. Some interesting ones so far. Yeah, thank you. There's some clear themes that are coming out from what people are saying already, especially around unrealistic expectations. I assume that's of people that you manage or colleagues around you. Different perspectives, different expectations, and the question of time. So this is coming out down there. Clarity around roles and responsibilities. Yeah, time, lack of resources and staffing. So many of these challenges are things that you cannot control yourself. So the amount of time that you have is difficult to control. Lack of resources and staffing, something that you will have limited control of. So there's a bit of a dividing line here between those things that you have control over and those things that you don't. Thank you very much, everybody. These are some of the common ones that I come across when I'm working, especially with leadership teams in healthcare. And just to give you an idea of kind of a flavor of it, challenging behavior. So often it's the behavior of an individual or a small group that people point to say, shouting, unbalance of voices, people unwilling to take on other people's opinions, etc. And arising out of that, a sense of avoidance and disengagement, because often in response to conflict, people step back, step away from it and disengage. And whether that's not coming to an MDT, not coming to a consultants meeting, staying at home, not wanting to come to work, it can manifest in a variety of different ways. You also get leaders feeling like they have to work as an ambassador or envoy between different competing groups. People retreat into silos, and so they shuttle between the two of them, or 3 groups, however many there are. There's also something that comes out very strongly, especially amongst the kind of clinical directors, heads of service that I work with, around balancing managerial and peer demands. In one sense, they are accountable to the managerial side of things, who require certain things of them, but also have to be their kind of peer representative with the managers. And that's a very, very difficult thing to try and balance. And that's one of the most common things I encounter with heads of service, at least, to say, how do I satisfy these competing demands? And then you get things which are kind of a little bit more kind of standard team dynamics, I suppose, around team communication issues, problems around decision making. I often work with senior groups around decision making. Power and hierarchy play into that people don't know quite where the lines are between the decisions that can be made by certain groups and the decisions that need to be talked about as a wider group. And then there's that just the load on people at the moment, I think, working in healthcare, but the load of having to do a essentially full-time managerial job alongside a full-time clinical job. I know it's not quite full-time, but that is the kind of the weight that people feel. So those are the kind of things that I see when I work around the system, just as a kind of snapshot. So to get into this, I wanted to refresh, if you've been on these before, or introduce you to a couple of really key concepts that we use as mediators. The first one here is, they're both from Harvard. The reason that we don't tend to get anywhere when we're in conflict essentially boils down to this, that we think that we're right and the other person is the problem. Believe it or not, they think that they're right and that we're the problem. And that conflict manifests primarily because neither person's conclusion makes sense to the other person. We just can't understand how they get there. They're just coming from a different perspective. And what underpins this, and this is again from Harvard, is this really key idea that as human beings, we make assumptions about other people's intentions based upon their impact on us. So as we go about the world, we're aware of our own intentions and other people's impact on us. But we're blind to other people's intentions and our impact on them because we can't see it, we're not in their heads. But when you walk past a colleague's desk and you say good morning and they don't look up, our go-to response is to think, is it something I did? So we project into that right-hand column what we fear might be there. And it's something that we see time and time again when we mediate, is that I'll go and meet one person who will say the other person is making my life a misery, they don't care, they're oblivious to it, or this stuff just doesn't bother them, they're making me feel incredibly bad. And then I'll go and see the other person and they'll say often almost exactly the same thing. And what has tended to happen is that this has come to life, that both people have projected what they fear might be there into that right-hand column. But that is difficult enough when you've got two people involved. So what do you do when you're trying to navigate this on a team basis or trying to lead a group of people with competing narratives? In that example, you've got two narratives that don't get on. Suddenly you've got 15. This is where I'd like to introduce you to Oshry, Oshry's total system theory. And Oshry's idea here is that we are all individuals within a complex network of social systems, and we're in a number of different social systems all at once. So, for example, your clinical service will be a particular system, and based upon where you see yourself in that system, you'll either see yourself as someone near the top, someone near the middle, or someone at the bottom. If you work in a hospital, your hospital will also be a system, and again, you'll see yourself somewhere top, middle, or bottom, maybe somewhere slightly different. But it can be really useful to think through what that means for us in terms of how we see ourselves at work. Because if you see yourself at the top end of a system and things aren't going well, you often feel isolated, you take all the responsibility on your shoulders, and you become a bit kind of myopic and focused in on the responsibilities that you have. If you're in the middle and things aren't going well, you will often feel very overloaded, stretched between two sides, unsupported. And if you're at the bottom, essentially you feel completely disempowered and detached from the rest of the whole. So that's if it's not going well. If it is going well, people at the top feel connected to everybody else within the system and they feel supported if you're in the middle. And if you're at the bottom, you feel like you're involved. There's a famous example that you may have heard of from one of the space programs where someone was mopping the floor at Cape Canaveral, and a journalist says, what are you doing here? And the person mopping the floor says, I'm part of a team putting a man on the moon. But that's the idea there of being involved, being part of a greater whole. And we spend a lot of our time trying to help teams move from that left-hand Oshry triangle side into that right-hand side. So just some framing ideas as we go about this. Second Mentimeter question for you here, just getting a little bit deeper into this. What do you think are the underlying sources of conflict? There may be some overlap with the first question here, but what do you think, if you drill down, what do you think are the underlying sources of conflict here? And as we go about this, please do put thoughts in the chat as well. I'd love to respond to them as we go. What resonates? What are you thinking?
Would be stress.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a kind of catch-all, kind of stress workload, having to do an increasing amount with increasingly little capacity to do it, I think is absolutely huge. Thank you, John and Tanya in the chat there. Perspectives of mutual goals, lack of understanding. Yeah. Yeah, and some interesting ones there. You'll look at, you can see the cloud coming together in front of you. So yeah, fatigue, isolation, fear, they're all kind of essential, they're kind of pretty essential human deep emotions. Yeah, someone has put values, wants and needs, absolutely, are the kind of like the driving forces. And Joanne, thank you. Yeah, not being listened to. One of the things that I kind of often refer to on our training is, conflict could be thought about as like an onion. And if I think of pretty much any conflict I've ever been involved in mediating, if you peel away enough layers of the onion, at the center is a sense of someone not feeling listened to, taken seriously, acknowledged, recognized. Yeah, so I think these, you're absolutely right, there's a really interesting cloud there, but these are the driving forces behind the conflict that can arise. And one of the things that I often notice when I'm working with teams is that it doesn't come out at the places that you'd think it would. I think top 3 conflict issues that I come across are probably Christmas rotas, seating plans, job plans. I mean, it's not about the Christmas rota, but it comes out about the Christmas rota, if that makes sense. So there's a bit of a bingo card I wanted to show you here as well, to give you a sense of kind of sources of conflict that we see when we work with teams. And there's we'll just have a little kind of wander around this bingo card. I've put it under kind of 4 main headings: kind of cultural, leadership, inter and intra-team tensions, and interpersonal. So cultural is an interesting one. I often encounter a bit of an institutional legacy with the teams that I work with. It's not unusual to be called in to work with a team that has been unable to work functionally together for a decade. And that's not really actually I'm not exaggerating particularly. It's often that these things have a very long tail. And often all of the members of the team can leave and change, but the team carries with it the legacy of what's gone before. And often you see kind of unchecked behavior. So to use a kind of an example, the first time someone shouts and storms out of a room, it's shocking for people, but then it soon enough just becomes what Tom does on a Wednesday at the meeting. So you get these sense of accepted norms, and that people promise that change is coming, but it doesn't really ever come. And so you get the sense of people just carrying this weight of unkept promises with them. Which brings us into the leadership column. And the first one there is the difficulty of performance management, and it's really, really tricky because there are very few levers, especially amongst senior colleagues, to bring about behavioural change. And I remember when I used to work at the GMC, I would get HR issues being sent to me, and I would think that people have referred this to the GMC because they've run out of ways of thinking about how to manage a particularly knotty performance issue or behavioural issue. Because there's this very kind of apparent unease about challenging colleagues. If you're running a hospital, the thing you probably don't want to do on a Monday morning is have to tangle with your trickiest, most senior doctor. And you get this kind of fear of conflict, fear of stepping into the spaces, leading to unclear decision making and avoidance. And then as you move into the kind of inter and intra-team tensions, you get this friction between people, avoidance, a lack of clarity over roles and responsibilities that I clocked that somebody put in the cloud earlier. That lack of clarity over roles and responsibilities is an enormously common reason for a breakdown within a team. And then you get kind of people moving into silos, kind of managerial nursing, medical silos, people skirmishing over territory, often like this is my bit, back off. And then on the interpersonal side of things, slights and perceived slights. It's the walking past the desk and not saying good morning. And when I work with people, it's quite common for people to bring up things from 5 or 6, 7 years ago. You know, I went to the conference and they didn't say hello to me. HIPPO, you probably can't guess, but HIPPO stands for highest paid person's opinion. They're the kind of most senior voices that tend to dominate the center ground in a conversation. That what you're after is a balance of voices in the group, and the highest paid person's opinion can often shut down other voices. They're often the most senior, loudest voice, and they set the agenda. Micromanagement and kind of common and garden personality clashes. So that's the kind of thing that we see when we work with teams. And I don't know if you do your own bingo card as we go, see how many of those you recognize. And when it escalates with a team, just to give you a flavor of this, in the early stages, what you see is a kind of repetition without resolution, a bit like a goldfish banging its nose against the side of the bowl. And people start to kind of draw their lines, and they say, well, this is a point of principle for me. It's my standpoint. You get that projection into the grey and speculating about people's motives. And even though it sounds very dramatic at this time, you get a kind of sense of hopelessness beginning, because people think, is this really how we do it? People start to think a bit more tactically, and you get the start of this slow erosion of trust within a group. As things escalate, it becomes about winning the argument. And you get this general build-up of resistance, that people aren't that willing to kind of go into help other people when they see them in trouble. And you get the start of this loss of common humanity, that people start seeing people less like their colleagues with families and friends and dreams, and more like obstacles. People start to notice. People start to avoid and be absent. And you get this kind of ink in the water idea. And what I mean by this is, if you imagine a glass of water and a pipette of blue ink, the first couple of times you drop some ink into the water, it disappears. You can't notice, it doesn't change. But you drop enough of those kind of drops of ink into the water, and the water starts changing color, until such time as you get up to that kind of severe end. And you may recognize this. I kind of hope you don't. But you do encounter teams that are often describe themselves as toxic, and that people are identified as the problem a lot, targeted. You get this new negative status quo where people don't blink when someone throws something, because it's just what happens. At this stage, everybody loses. It's very factional. Point scoring is more important than patient care. And it's at this stage where you see the carousel of complaints, grievances, regulatory referrals, etc. So that if you get that, that's how it can go from green to amber and red in that team setting. But really the thing here is that you don't need to get there necessarily, that you're gonna, in your work as a leader, encounter conflict. But what you do with it is kind of up for grabs. And so what I was going to do in this kind of second half of this presentation is give you some thoughts and ideas around how you might want to engage with this earlier on, to see if you can get it away from escalating up into that amber and red zone. And I can see, thank you, Simon, you put some questions in the chat. Yeah, love to have your comments and thoughts as we go as well. So the first idea that I wanted to put past you here is this idea from Patrick Lencioni about the basic foundations of effective teamwork. And Lencioni's pyramid here is incremental, so you've got to build from the bottom up. And he said the most important thing that you need to try and foster in your team is this sense of trust, inclusion, and psychological safety. That is the bedrock upon which all teams are built. Because when you've got that, you can have constructive disagreement. So it's not destructive, unpleasant conflict. It's a sense of being able to really dig into the difficult topics and be constructive about them. And if you can do those two things, you have a better cohesive team. You're clearer about your roles and responsibilities, and you can really focus on where you're going together as a group. So what you want to drill down into as a leader is that bottom layer. It's really shoring up or developing that layer at level 1. And that's by looking at trust. You may have heard of Brené Brown. She's a Texan social scientist. She's written a lot about trust in healthcare. And she said this, that trust is the stacking and layering of small moments and reciprocal vulnerability over time. Trust and vulnerability grow together. If you betray one, you destroy them both. But the research is clear that trust is built in those small moments. It's a TED talk, by the way. If you Google it, it's good. But her takeaway message, which is really useful for us here, is that trust is a word that's made real by action. So it's about what you do, and it's about how you behave. It's not what goes on up here. So as a leader, it's how you behave with people that sets the tone. Psychological safety is a slightly unusual term that you might have heard of, but it's this idea coined by Amy Edmondson at Harvard, that if you're going to do one thing in a team, if you're going to bring around one thing, it's this interpersonal climate where people feel able to express ideas and ask questions, acknowledge mistakes, raise concerns. And she says it's a bit of a canary in the coal mine. You kind of know if you've got it or not. But she says it's the number one thing that you should be looking to develop in your team. So how do you do that? Well, here are some ideas from Brené Brown and from Stephen Covey, who's a management consultant who's written a lot about credibility and trust. And I would use this as a bit of a kind of prompt for you as a leader here. How many of these am I thinking about? So the first one here is credibility. The question is, can other people tell by my behavior that I have their best interests at heart? It's all about behavior, what you're seen to do. The next two kind of linked, reliability. Do I do what I say I'm going to do? And consistency. Do people know what they're going to get when they deal with me? And reliability and consistency in the literature on trust are the two that are most indicators important to get right. Fault is a little bit different. It's about how well you hold information and experiences that aren't yours to share. Integrity and courage, pretty linked as well. Are you clear about your values? Are you standing up for them? Are you choosing right over what's easy? And the last one, I think possibly particularly important to leadership, I suppose maybe at kind of this time of year doing your work, does your team feel like you're on the journey together? Are you with them? Do they feel like you're walking alongside them? So again, just some prompts there for you to kind of think about as a leader. And again, I wonder in the chat, do any of those resonate particularly with you? Do any of those stand out to you? Because this is an interesting thing to kind of, I suppose, take forward, is this idea as a leader that people are constantly auditioning for role models. And you will be as well. And I'm sure if you think back to throughout your career, you would have looked around the teams that you worked in and thought, I really like that. I want to do that. And also, I'm definitely not going to do it like that. So the question for you is, what do you want people to see? What do you want people to see? The last section here is introducing you to a framework that I hope will be very useful to you in having challenging conversations. You may have heard of this before. It's the SBI framework, but I've slightly amended it to give you a brackets RC at the end there, because there's some bits that they don't include that I think are really important. So this is a way of going into a conversation that will hopefully avoid a defensive, blame-fueled response. So what you want to be doing here is starting by simply describing the situation in which the behavior occurred and being specific as possible about it. So saying something like, I'd like to discuss the exchange we had in yesterday's meeting. So describe the specific situation, then describe the behavior. And what you're looking for is actual observable behavior. It's factual. It's not about your thoughts about this. So when I said we couldn't act on the suggestions that you made, you stood up and walked out of the room. So it's an observable thing. And then you describe the impact on you or on others if they've come to you. So I was surprised and hurt by that. And then you move into the requests zone, and it's requests that you have of them and ask for requests as they have of you. So something like, in the future, I'd ask that you don't just walk out of the room, but I'd like to try and find a way of engaging with the kind of things that came up, and engaging with those frustrations together. What are your thoughts? How might that work? So it's sharing the problem and getting their view on it. And then closing by demonstrating thanks and appreciation for their time. So saying, thank you for listening, I appreciate it. Grateful to hear your perspective. And one of the nice things about this approach is it should give you some kind of like an island of stability to be able to navigate a difficult conversation. And it's not overly challenging because it's quite specific, and it shouldn't bring about a blame response. So I don't know if you find that helpful, but it tends to be useful for the people I work with to kind of structure those difficult conversations. A couple of thoughts about how you might want to do that. Thoughts beforehand. Who do I want to have the conversation with? When is a good time to have it? Context, timing, what kind of room would work? How will I word the invitation? How am I going to frame it? Strangely important. And for you, in your own mind, can you get yourself into a respectful and blame-free space? Easier to say on a slide than it is to do in reality, probably, but it's about, can I step back from this and think of myself with a kind of leadership coaching mindset? How can I help this person? How can I help them move through where they are? And then preparing yourself for this. Are you clear about the behavior that you want to challenge? Have you thought about what you want to say? And what are your motivations behind this? Where do you want to get to? Why do you want to do it? And our top tip here is to practice it before you do it, even if it's a matter of writing out the opening couple of sentences, because the start is, unfortunately, the hardest to get right and the most important to get right. So drafting a couple of sentences and saying them out loud can be really grounding for you. And the last thing here I wanted to share with you, and this is taken from a really good leadership book called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It's not medical, it's a tech book, but she has these radically candid principles for challenging conversations that I wanted to share with you. So this is the idea of not holding back for fear of hurting someone. And that happens quite a lot of the time. She uses an example in her world of when she hired someone who she really liked, and it wasn't going well, and she didn't feel like she could say anything. So after a year, she ends up letting them go. And the person said, "That's so unkind. Why didn't you just tell me?" And she said she came to the realization that clear is kind. So actually, if you're holding back because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, you might be doing more hurt than if you are more straightforward with them. So she says, be straightforward. She also says, expect and welcome a reciprocal challenge. It's not unusual, so be humble with it. That people's initial response might be to be defensive and say, to challenge you about it. So that's okay too. Don't be brutal, be kind. Don't over talk. I remember when I was training to be a mediator, the mediation trainer said, if you're doing all the talking, you're not doing it right. So something to think about there. So explore what's going on for that other person as well as explaining your perspective. Don't be surprised by strong emotion. I think it's almost more common in this territory to get some of that, but it might not be their final response. So allow them to go through that emotional arc a little bit. And also, I suppose this is especially true with less senior colleagues. Be really mindful of false yeses. That because these conversations can be anxiety provoking, people might just agree when they don't really want to, or just say yes and it's not realistic. So just gently tease out the whether or not what you're asking is going to be achievable from the other person. So I'm going to stop sharing. That's the kind of stuff that I wanted to share with you. And I wonder, it would be great to know what you think about that. What has it made you think? What's resonated or not? What's on your mind? Casting my eyes around the Zoom room.
Thank you very much, Oscar. That was great. Really great presentation as always. I'm going to stop the recording now so we can move on to the Q&A.